Hey guys, today we'll be covering a 2002 thriller film called Watcher. The movie begins as an American woman named Julia moves to Bucharest, Romania, along with her husband Francis, who has been transferred there for work. Francis is half Romanian, so he is well accustomed to the language and surroundings. However, it is Julia's first time in a foreign country, so she is confused about everything. The couple moves into a lavish apartment, which has a large picture window. After setting everything up, they go to rest. However, Julia, who is tired, is having trouble sleeping. She goes near the window to relax, but just then, she notices a man staring at her from the building across the road. Julia finds it very odd, but before she can take any action, Francis wakes up and takes her back to bed. The next morning, Francis gets a call from work and leaves without informing Julia. While Francis is busy, Julia strolls through the city to familiarize herself with the surroundings. However, the vast differences in languages and culture make it difficult for her to adjust. One night, Julia again looks through the window to check if the man is staring at her. At first, she doesn't see him and gets relieved, but when she turns off the light, she finds him in the exact same spot, staring at her. After a while, Francis arrives home and the couple goes out for a short walk. On the way, they come across a crowd in an ambulance with a guy sitting there. When they ask around, they learn that a girl from the area has been recently murdered. The following morning, Julia watches the news about the murder on TV, but isn't able to comprehend the Romanian language. Just then, Francis reveals that one of their neighbors was murdered, and the guy from the ambulance was the one who found the body. This terrifies Julia, and she immediately tells Francis about the creep who stares at her every night. However, Francis tries to calm her down, mentioning that she is just being paranoid because of her new surroundings. In the evening, Francis invites his colleagues for dinner. As the group converses, Julia reveals that she used to be an aspiring actress back in America, but had to quit because of some problems. However, she is considering getting back into acting now. Following this, the group starts talking about the murder which took place the night before. One of the colleagues mentions that the victim was brutally beheaded in her apartment, and the killer is suspected to be the notorious serial killer named the Spider. This makes Julia anxious, and she immediately goes outside. There, she meets her neighbor Irina, and the two introduce themselves before departing. The next day, while Francis is at work, Julia searches the internet for information about the spider. In no time, she comes across an interview with one of the survivors, who reveals that she felt she was being followed for weeks before the tragic night. Expectedly, this instills more fear into Julia, and she starts assuming that the stalker from across the street is the spider. Later, while she is strolling through the city, she senses that someone is following her. Terrified, she immediately runs into a movie theater to lose him. However, the man follows her there and sits right behind her. Julia gathers all her courage and turns back to see his face, but due to fear, can only manage to notice his shoes. Just then, the man leans towards her, but before he can do anything, Julia runs out of the place. That night, when Francis returns home, he finds Julia in shock. On asking, Julia reveals everything, and Francis takes her back to the supermarket to review the CCTV footage. However, when they check the footage, Francis simply assumes that it was a misunderstanding. Instead, he tells Julia that the man might have been staring at her, as she was doing the same to him. After the incident, Julia becomes scared to venture outside and spends all her time inside the apartment. To make matters worse, Francis becomes even busier at work, and he returns home late at night. One night when she is sitting alone, all of a sudden, she hears someone banging on her door. Julia fears the worst and slowly opens the door, but gets relieved when she notices a neighbor on the other side. The lady, who seems to be distressed, continuously asks her about something, but Julia cannot understand the language. Just then, Irina arrives and reveals that the lady is searching for her lost cat. In the next scene, Irina invites Julia to her place for a drink, and both of them hit it off instantly. Irina consoles Julia and mentions that it's okay to feel strange in a new place. She then shares her own life story, where she was isolated and lonely when she moved to London to learn ballet. Just as they are talking, Irina's ex-boyfriend Christian knocks on the door, but Irina quickly sends him away. After a while, Irina shows her pistol to Julia and reveals that she uses it for protection. Seeing this, Julia opens up about how the man across the street has been stalking her for weeks. After Julia returns to her apartment, she decides to confront the man and conclude if he is actually looking at her or if she is just being paranoid. She opens the curtains and turns off the lights. As usual, the man is standing in the window. To make sure if her doubts are real, Julia waves at him, and surprisingly, the man waves back. This makes it evident that the man has been keeping an eye on her. As soon as Francis arrives home, Julia tells him everything and asks him to call the police. After interrogating Julia, the policeman and Francis, who are not quite convinced with Julia's complaint, go to the next building to speak with the man. Francis returns home and tells Julia that even if he is the same person, there's nothing to fear, and she is being unreasonably paranoid. Hearing this, Julia is disappointed and tells him that she doesn't feel safe and wants to leave the place. The following day, Julia finally gathers some courage and gets out of her apartment. While walking around the city, she notices the stalker and starts following him. After a while, she reaches a strip club where she meets Irina, who happens to work there. She also finds out that the man works there as a cleaner. Following this, she tells everything to Irina and tries getting information about the man, but the latter replies that she knows nothing about him since she is new to the place. Disappointed, Julia prepares to leave, but before that, Irina promises to look after her. That night, as Julia is sitting alone, she suddenly hears Irina cry from her apartment. She immediately rushes there and knocks on her door, but Irina does not answer. The commotion wakes up a lot of neighbors and they all gather at the spot. Julia desperately tries to convince them that Irina is in trouble, but no one understands her. However, she somehow manages to convince the landlady, but when the latter opens the door, they find it empty with only the cat inside. Believing that the cat was the culprit behind the noise, everyone departs to their respective apartments. Meanwhile, Julia looks at the closet and finds it strange, but before she can inspect it, the landlady asks her to leave. In the next scene, Frances arrives home and learns about the incident from the landlady. She warns them by saying that she doesn't want troublesome tenants in her building. Worried for his wife, Frances apologizes to Julia for not being around her and promises to support her more. The next day, Julia hears Irina's ex-boyfriend Christian knocking at her door. She tells him about last night and that Irina has not returned home. After a while, she calls Irina and hears her phone ringing from her apartment, but recalls that no one's there. This worries both Julia and Christian. After a bit of discussion, Julia convinces Christian to accompany her to the next building so that she can confront the man. Since she saw him working at the same club as Irina, she suspects that the man is responsible for her disappearance. As soon as they reach the apartment, Christian knocks on the door, but no one opens it. Enraged, he starts cussing at the man, but even so, no one replies. After a while, Christian gets a call from someone and decides to leave. He tells Julia to inform him if she finds anything suspicious or hears anything from Irina. After Christian is gone, Julia decides to knock on the door herself. This time, an old man opens the door who seems terrified by all the obscenities that Christian hurled at him. Seeing this, Julia apologizes and leaves the place. However, on her way back, she encounters the stalker and runs away immediately. Later that night, after Frances returns home, a police officer arrives at their apartment with the man who has been following her. The police mentions that the man's name is Daniel Weber, who lives across the street. Surprisingly, Daniel accuses Julia of stalking him at his work and threatening his old father at his apartment. Soon, an argument breaks out between the two parties, but the police quickly defuse the situation and conclude that all the incidents were just a misunderstanding. They then ask Julia and Daniel to shake hands and apologize to each other. Julia obliges, but she is humiliated by the incident. In the next scene, Frances takes Julia to a work party. There, one of Frances's co-workers informs Julia that the serial killer has been arrested and that she shouldn't live in fear anymore. While Frances talks to his co-workers in Romanian, Julia somehow understands that the group is making fun of her. She has an argument with Frances, who yells at her and says that he is fed up with her fear fantasies and paranoia and can't take it anymore. Depressed and broken, Julia leaves the party and heads home. When Julia gets to the train, she is terrified to see Daniel sitting in the distance. He comes over and sits near her. He then reveals why he stares at her all night. He says that his life has become boring and his daily routine consists of caring for his sick father and working as a cleaner. As a result, he stares at people and it brings him happiness. For years, no one noticed him, but then a beautiful girl like Julia noticed and waved at him. This made him happy, so now he wants to be friends with her. While he is talking, Julia notices something that looks like a decapitated head in his shopping bag and gets terrified. Hence, she starts panicking, and after the train reaches a station, she leaves. As soon as she returns to her apartment, she starts packing her bags to leave. However, she stops after hearing the sound of music at Irina's apartment. Curious, she heads to the place, and there, she is horrified to see Irina's decapitated body on a chair. But before she can cry for help, Daniel covers her face with a plastic bag and knocks her unconscious. In the next scene, when Julia wakes up, Daniel explains how he killed Irina and hid her body in her closet when Julia and the landlady came there searching for Irina a few days back. Right then, Frances arrives home and starts calling out for his wife. Hearing this, Julia tries to scream for help, but Daniel makes a small cut on her throat, rendering her mute. Despite this, she crawls on the floor with blood oozing out of her throat. However, as soon as she opens Irina's drawer to retrieve the pistol, she loses consciousness due to excessive bleeding. Meanwhile, when Francis fails to find Julia, he calls her on her phone and is surprised to hear the phone ringing from Irina's apartment. As he proceeds to the place, he sees Daniel leaving. Shocked, Francis stands still for a moment, but soon gains his senses. However, just as he is about to make a move, someone shoots Daniel several times from inside the apartment. Soon, a bloodied and delirious Julia walks out of the apartment with Irina's pistol in her hand. The movie ends as Julia angrily stares at her husband as if she is trying to say that she was right.